The land itself seemed unwilling to host them, crops withering and animals dying without cause. But the true rot lay not in the fields, but in the bloodline rooted there. Welcome to the forgotten. England's landscape is filled with ruins, crumbling abbeys, moss-covered stones, and manor houses long reduced to foundations in the earth. Most of them carry names etched into history, remembered through parish records, royal decrees, or at least whispered folk tales that survived the centuries. But there exists one story different from the rest, a family whose very existence seems to have been deliberately erased. Their name once carried weight in villages scattered across Dorset and the southern shires. It was spoken in hushed tones, not as gossip, but as warning. Today, the name is absent from census ledgers, missing from burial registers, scratched out of church records as if someone made certain no trace of them remained. Yet fragments survive in unexpected places, half-burned letters in county archives, strange notations in a doctor's ledger, and the fading memories of villagers who passed down uneasy tales about the household that lived in the hollow. The story of this family is not merely one of disappearance, it is one of deliberate silence. Historians like to say history is written by the victors, but sometimes history is unwritten, unraveled strand by strand until only shadows remain. What would drive an entire community to erase a lineage from memory? Why would neighbors choose not to record births, deaths, or marriages? And why, centuries later, does the mere mention of their surname still cause locals to shift uneasily, as though repeating it might invite something back? In Dorset, where chalk hills give way to mist-soaked valleys, the family's estate once stood. It was never large, never grand enough to be remembered in the annals of aristocracy, yet it carried an aura, a presence that marked it apart. Villagers told stories of windows that were always shuttered, even in summer light, and of fields where livestock sickened without cause. Children were told never to wander too close to the hollow, not because of wolves or highwaymen, but because of the family who lived there. Their children, villagers said, were not like other children. The record of their existence should have been clear. Every English parish prided itself on maintaining meticulous registers of baptism and burial, of marriage bans and property holdings. But for this family, the page is thin. Entries vanish mid-sentence. Margins are left blank where names should be. It is as if an unseen hand not only closed the book on them, but tore out the chapters altogether. And yet, despite the absence of formal proof, the echoes remain. In folklore, in fragments of testimony, in the way the land itself feels heavy with memory, their story survives. Not celebrated, not even acknowledged, but whispered like a curse you dare not speak aloud. What you are about to hear is not a tale preserved in libraries. It is a history that someone tried to bury. But the earth never fully swallows what is sown within it. Some truths refuse to die, and this family, England's forgotten family, is one of them. The story begins in Dorset, in a hollow few maps ever bothered to mark. It was the kind of valley where sunlight struggled to reach the ground, where fog rolled in before dusk and did not lift until well after morning. Travelers described it as a place the land itself rejected. Birds avoided nesting in the trees that bordered the hollow. Crops, when planted, sprouted weak and pale, as if the soil resisted the effort to nurture them. Livestock driven into the valley grew sick, their bones thinning, their hides dulling, until farmers swore the earth itself carried a sickness. And in the center of this mist-drenched place stood the estate of the family that locals whispered about for generations, a house that seemed more like a scar than a home. It was never grand, not in the sense of England's stately manners. Built of heavy stone and weathered timber, the house crouched against the hillside, its windows narrow and dark, its roofline bent under centuries of damp. Yet it carried an authority far greater than its appearance. Children dared each other to approach the iron gate, to touch the rusting latch, but few made it beyond the hedgerows. They spoke of a pressure in the air, a heaviness that grew stronger the closer one stepped, as though the hollow itself wanted to turn intruders back. Those who worked the land refused to stay once night fell. Hired men left tools behind rather than linger past sundown, claiming they saw shapes moving between the trees or faces watching from the upper windows of the house. Parish accounts from the late 1700s mention the property, though not in detail. The words abandoned field, lost herd, and tainted crop appear often enough to suggest that the estate carried a reputation long before the family's name was whispered with fear. One farmer wrote in his diary that he would rather plow barren chalk than let his cattle graze near the hollow again. Another account describes an entire work crew quitting after a single season, claiming they heard voices in the fog when no one else was near. It is said that fog in Dorset has a voice of its own, the kind that tricks you into thinking someone follows at your heels. But in this hollow, the fog clung too tightly, muffled sound too completely, until those inside it swore they were deafened. The silence was not peaceful, it was suffocating. When villagers spoke of the family's estate, they never used its name. They called it simply the Hollow, as if the place had swallowed the words along with the lives that once tried to root there. And though centuries have passed, the land remains the same, unsettled, unwelcoming, a patch of earth where memory clings like the mist, and where the family's presence feels less like history and more like a wound that never healed. The parish records of Dorset are, for the most part, models of order and precision. Births, baptisms, marriages, and burials were carefully written in neat, practiced hands, often with notes about lineage, property, or a family's place in the village. But when the family in the hollow appears, the records shift. Their entries grow erratic, incomplete, sometimes scratched out altogether. A child is baptized without the mother's name. A marriage is listed, but the bride's maiden name repeats the groom's, as though no outsider ever crossed into their bloodline. A burial is noted, yet the grave itself cannot be found in the churchyard. It is a puzzle pieced together only by those willing to read between the lines, and what emerges is disturbing. Generation after generation, the family married only within itself. The earliest accounts suggest it began quietly, with cousins marrying cousins, the kind of unions not unheard of in isolated villages where travel was scarce and outsiders few. But as the decades wore on, the practice did not fade. Instead, it became deliberate. Brothers married nieces, uncles took wives within their own kin. The bloodline folded inward, closing itself off like a knot that refused to untangle. Each baptism carried the same surname. Each signature in the parish book mirrored the one before it, until the records resembled a circle, endlessly repeating the same names. It was in the children that the consequences became most visible. Midwives whispered of births where infants came too soon, frail and struggling, their skin translucent, their limbs uneven. Some did not live past their first days. Others survived but carried marks that villagers could not ignore. Eyes of mismatched color, jaws that slanted unnaturally, spines bent before adolescence. And yet there was something eerily uniform about them. Witnesses described the way siblings resembled one another, not in the usual sense, but with a disturbing precision, as though each face had been stamped from the same mold. A boy born in 1812 was said to look indistinguishable from an uncle buried 20 years earlier, down to the slope of the brow and the tilt of the chin. Doctors, when called, seldom returned a second time. One physician's notes, found later in the county archive, spoke bluntly, "This is not mere sickness of the body. It is the sickness of the blood itself, a repetition of deformity that suggests intention rather than chance." The note was dated and signed, yet weeks later the physician's practice abruptly closed, his disappearance never explained. Villagers avoided naming the truth aloud, but everyone knew what the pattern meant. This was not simply isolation, it was preservation. The family had chosen to keep their line locked within itself, as though they believed mixing with outsiders would dilute something sacred or something cursed. And as the generations passed, the results of that choice became etched into their very flesh, carried in the mirrored features of children who seemed less like individuals and more like reflections of a single, distorted face passed down through time. The house that stood in the hollow was less a manor than a monument to absence. From the road, if one dared approach far enough to glimpse it through the fog, the building appeared hunched and weary, its stonework blackened by centuries of damp, its roof sagging beneath moss and rot. Every window was shuttered, heavy wooden boards bolted from within, and even in the height of summer no curtain ever stirred. Travelers often remarked that it looked uninhabited, abandoned even, but those who lingered long enough swore they saw faint movements in the upper rooms, as though someone watched from behind the layers of cloth and timber. Inside, for those few who crossed its threshold, the air was different. It pressed down heavy, as though the walls themselves exhaled a damp breath that never quite cleared. Dust clung to everything, not in the careless way of neglect, but as if the house resisted the idea of light or movement disturbing it. The rooms were sparsely furnished, hand-carved chairs, a long table scarred with knife marks, narrow beds pushed close together. Yet what unsettled visitors most was not the poverty of the space, but the silence. It was not the peaceful quiet of a countryside home. It was a silence so dense it seemed alive, swelling between the walls, until every footstep, every breath, felt smothered. Locals told stories of men hired to deliver goods, sacks of grain, bolts of cloth, firewood stacked by the kitchen door. They spoke of standing in the entryway, calling out, and receiving no reply. And then, just as they turned to leave, a knock would sound deep within the house, deliberate and slow. Some said it came from the walls themselves, others from the floorboards beneath their feet. One boy swore he heard the sound following him down the hall, each knock timed with his steps, until he fled and never returned. Neighbors noted the way the drapes never opened, thick cloth nailed across the frames to keep the outside world from peering in. Lamps glowed faintly at dusk, flickering through the cracks in the shutters, but no laughter, no voices, ever drifted from within. At times, villagers claimed they could hear movement chairs scraping, doors closing softly, but always muffled, as though the house swallowed sound before it could escape. The manor became less a home and more a symbol, a reminder of the family's strangeness. People avoided the hollow not only for the mist or the sickness of the soil, but for the knowledge that behind those shuttered windows lay a silence that felt watchful, a silence that seemed to wait. And in that silence, the family endured, hidden from the world, bound together by secrets that even the walls themselves seemed determined to keep. In 1784, a physician from a nearby parish was summoned to the hollow under circumstances that remain unclear. His name appeared briefly in county records, though never in connection with the family directly, only in a ledger found decades later in the damp recess of an archive. The ledger was ordinary enough, filled with accounts of fevers, fractures, and the everyday afflictions of rural England. But between those familiar entries there appears a page that feels out of place, a page that reads more like a warning than a medical observation. Written in a careful but unsettled hand, the physician describes a household where every face reflects the other, as though the blood has no will but to repeat itself. He notes the children's unnatural paleness, skin almost translucent in certain light, and features so mirrored that I could not distinguish one from another. It was, he wrote, a sickness not of the body alone, but of the blood itself, as though the very lineage is unwell. The entry grows stranger with each line. He records a child whose eyes did not move in unison, one lagging behind the other as though connected to a different mind. He describes limbs of uneven length, jaws set at angles that made speech difficult, and a silence in the household that seemed cultivated, as if voices were unwelcome. The children do not speak unless prompted, he wrote, and when they do, the words are faint, broken, as if unfamiliar with the shape of sound. He notes his own unease, remarking that the family watched him closely as he examined the children, their stares fixed and unblinking. "It is not their illness that chills me," he confessed, "but the way their silence seems learned, as though enforced." Weeks after this entry, the ledger ends abruptly. There are no further notes from the physician, no conclusion, no final remarks. County records indicate that he was last seen traveling by horse along the ridge road that leads toward the hollow. His horse was discovered days later, grazing freely at the edge of a village, its saddle empty. Of the physician himself, there was no trace. His practice closed without explanation, his name absent from subsequent parish reports, his belongings dispersed quietly, as though his absence was not to be questioned. The page describing the family survived only by chance, tucked into a misfiled archive, its ink fading but still legible enough to chill. For those who have read it, the detail most haunting is not the deformities or the sickness he recorded, but the doctor's final line, scrawled hastily at the bottom of the page. "There is something unnatural here, something I cannot treat, for it does not wish to be cured." It began quietly, almost too quietly to stir alarm. A farmhand hired to tend the fields near the hollow vanished after a single season. At first, no one thought much of it. Men in those days often drifted from one farm to another, chasing wages or fleeing debts. But when his tools were found still resting by the fence line, his coat folded neatly on the rail as though he intended to return, questions began to spread. His name was written in the parish log, a simple note beside it, "Missing." Weeks later, the entry was crossed through with a faint line, as if someone wished to erase even the suggestion of him. Not long after, a traveling tinker passed through the valley. He had been seen in the nearby village only a day earlier, mending pots and sharpening knives. He was remembered as a cheerful man, one who always carried a song with his work. His final known stop was the hollow, where locals swore he had gone to offer his trade. His cart was later found abandoned at the edge of the woods, wheels sunk into the mud, tools scattered as though left in haste. Of the man himself, there was nothing. Not a footprint, not a trace of struggle, only silence, where his song once lingered. Then came the census taker, an official tasked with logging every household in the parish. His notes survive in the county archive, each line crisp and orderly, until the moment he reached the hollow. His last entry is a half-finished sentence, "The family here," and nothing more. His ledger was discovered months later in a drawer at the parish office, the ink smudged, the handwriting abruptly cut off. The census taker never returned home. His absence was remarked upon for a time, then quietly forgotten, his name fading into the long list of men who vanished without explanation. Each disappearance was noted briefly, but as the years passed, the records themselves grew thinner, as though the clerks were reluctant to commit such things to paper. Cases were dropped. Notes were scratched out. In some ledgers, entire pages were missing, torn neatly from the binding. Villagers whispered that the hollow consumed not just people but memory, swallowing the evidence of what it touched. It became common knowledge, spoken only in hushed tones, that those who ventured too near the estate rarely returned, and yet no one confronted the family directly. Fear held the community in place, a silent agreement that it was better to turn away than to acknowledge what was happening. The disappearances were not accidents, the villagers knew. They were part of the hollow itself, a shadow spreading outward, erasing names one by one until even the records of their existence seemed unwilling to remain. The villagers said it was the children who unsettled them most. Adults could be explained away strange habits, withdrawn manners, the kind of eccentricity rural England often tolerated. But children were supposed to be different. They were meant to run, to laugh, to spill noise into the fields and lanes. The children of the hollow never did. Those who claimed to have seen them spoke of pale figures drifting among the hedgerows, small bodies moving stiffly, as if every gesture weighed more than it should. Their eyes were always the first thing noticed, too large, too wide, lingering too long on anyone unlucky enough to cross their gaze. Farmers driving their herds along the ridge reported glimpses of them standing in the fields at dusk, unmoving, their heads tilted as though studying every detail of the passing world. One woman told her grandchildren that she once saw three of them together gathered at the edge of a field. They were not playing, not even speaking, only standing shoulder to shoulder, watching the scarecrow that swayed in the wind. She said they mirrored its movements exactly, tilting their heads when it tilted, shifting when it shifted, until she fled in fear that the children had become less human than the figure itself. Another man, a shepherd, recalled returning from the pasture one evening and finding a small figure crouched in the ditch by the lane. At first he thought it was an injured lamb, but when he drew closer, he realized it was a child. The boy's eyes reflected the lamplight like an animal's, and when the shepherd called out, the boy only tilted his head and scuttled into the fog, limbs jerking as if his joints had forgotten how to bend naturally. The stories were always the same children seen where they should not be, standing too still, staring too intently, their silence heavier than words could ever be. No one recalled hearing them laugh, not once, not in decades. Even in the rare moments when they ventured into town, brought along by the eldest son for supplies, they never spoke. They kept close together, their faces so similar it was hard to tell them apart, their eyes scanning the crowd with a calm that felt far older than childhood. Villagers said it was like being studied, as if the children were not part of the world but observers of it. It was this watchfulness that unnerved people most. Laughter might have softened them, play might have made them seem like other children. But the hollow's offspring carried no trace of innocence, only a silence that pressed into the marrow of anyone who met their gaze. They were not merely children born into isolation. They were reflections of something deeper, something carried in the blood that set them apart, leaving behind whispers that echoed long after they had vanished back into the mist. In the late years of the 18th century, when the parish still attempted to hold some authority over the scattered households of Dorset, word spread of a troubling encounter between the family in the hollow and the local vicar. Death had finally touched their house in a way too visible to hide. Neighbors saw a wagon creak down the lane, carrying three crude wooden coffins draped in damp cloth. It was unusual enough that the family chose to bury their dead in a plot hidden deep within their own grounds, rather than in the parish churchyard. But this time they summoned the Anglican priest, as custom demanded, to read the rites. The request was strange, almost reluctant, as though forced by obligation rather than faith, yet the priest agreed. He set out toward the hollow with his Bible under his arm, not knowing that what he found there would shake him to his core. His private journal, discovered many years later in a locked parish chest, offers the only surviving testimony of that burial. In its pages he wrote of a family gathered silently around the graves, their faces pale in the mist, their eyes fixed on him with a disturbing intensity. The coffins, he noted, were unusually heavy, and the odor that rose from them made his hands tremble as he reached for the holy water. When the lids were drawn back, just enough for him to peer inside, he froze. What lay within, he wrote, were not Christian remains. He did not elaborate in detail, but his words suggest something twisted, something that bore the shape of human form yet carried deformities that seemed beyond nature. He mentioned limbs bent in impossible angles, faces too alike to be chance, and skin so pallid that it reminded him of wax. The priest closed his book and refused the rite. Before the gathered family, he declared that he could not consecrate what he saw, that these burials did not belong under the protection of the church. Witnesses, if indeed any outsiders were present, never spoke of what happened next. But in his journal, the priest wrote of a silence so suffocating he could scarcely breathe, broken only by the sound of the earth itself shifting as the family began to bury their dead without a word. He fled before the last coffin was covered. The journal's final pages grow increasingly disjointed. His handwriting falters, lines are crossed out, and fragments of sentences appear as though written in great haste. The very last page is the most disturbing. Half of it has been scorched, the edges blackened as if it had been pressed too close to fire. What survives reads only, "They do not bury the dead, they plant them. After that, the record ends." Within a year, the priest himself was gone, his absence explained in parish notes only as transferred north, though no further assignment was ever found. His warning lingers, fragile as the charred pages of his journal, a reminder that some graves are not meant to be blessed, and some deaths are not meant to be spoken of. The fire came without warning, a sudden bloom of orange against the heavy Dorset mist, lighting the hollow in ways it had not been lit for generations. From the ridge above, villagers saw the smoke rising like a dark column, thicker and darker than any hearth could produce. They gathered along the lanes, watching as flames licked through the timbers of Hollow Grange, the family's manor that had stood sealed and silent for so long. At first, there was a hushed hope that the blaze might purge the land, that perhaps the sickness which clung to that valley would be burned away with the walls. But those who dared creep closer would later speak of a sight so unnatural that even fire could not be trusted to cleanse it. Witnesses described figures standing within the inferno itself. Through the shattered windows, shapes were visible, tall and thin, some small as children, framed by the glow of burning beams. They did not scream, they did not flee, they only stood, watching silently as the house collapsed around them. One farmer swore he saw a girl no older than 10 with hair alight like a torch, her face expressionless as she stared outward into the night. Another insisted he glimpsed an older man, his features gaunt and sharp, standing motionless in the center hall as the roof fell, the flames wrapping him in light without so much as a cry. When the blaze finally died, leaving only blackened stone and the stench of charred wood, the villagers expected to find bodies among the ruins. But when they searched the ash, there was nothing. No remains, no bones, not even fragments of teeth or charred limbs. The coffins in the family's private plot stood undisturbed, their earth unturned, as though death itself refused to claim what lived in that house. Officials filed brief notes in parish records, calling it a tragic fire, but the absence of the dead was never explained. In time, the entry was shortened, revised, until all that remained was the vague mention of a dwelling lost to flames. Those who had seen the figures within the fire spoke less as the years went on, fearful of being mocked, or worse, of drawing the family's notice. Some suggested the blaze was no accident, that it was a ritual of cleansing by the family themselves, a final act to seal away whatever secrets lived in those walls. Others claimed the fire had not killed them at all, that they had stepped into it willingly, untouched, and simply vanished with the smoke. The hollow remained, the ruins sinking slowly into the soil, but neighbors swore the valley grew even quieter after that night, as if the earth itself was mourning or remembering. In the absence of bodies, there could be no closure. The fire was supposed to be an end, yet it became another beginning, another chapter in a story that refused to die. The villagers, standing in silence as the flames consumed the grange, were left with a truth more terrifying than death. Some families do not burn, and some legacies cannot be destroyed by fire. Decades passed after the fire at Hollow Grange, and in time the ruins were left to sink into the earth. Ivy climbed over the scorched stone, moss thickened in the cracks, and eventually the valley swallowed what remained until it was little more than a scar in the hillside. For many, the story ended there. The family was spoken of as if they had been extinguished with the blaze, consumed and buried by fire. Yet in dusty boxes of parish archives and among the forgotten drawers of county clerks, another trail slowly began to surface. Scraps of correspondence, brittle with age and stained by damp, hinted at a truth the villagers had not dared consider. The family had not died in Dorset at all. They had moved. The first letter was dated 1811, written in a hand that was neat but oddly formal, as though the writer had learned English by imitation rather than birth. It was addressed to a land agent in Yorkshire and bore a familiar surname, one too rare to be coincidence. The writer inquired about the availability of a remote farmstead near the moors, insisting that privacy was of utmost importance. A second letter followed a month later, pressed with the same wax seal, asking whether the nearest parish priest respected family traditions, and whether records of birth and death were required by law. The agent's reply is missing, but the correspondence itself was enough to chill those who uncovered it, for it suggested that the bloodline survived, seeking new soil far from Dorset. More scraps emerged over the years. A school ledger in a Yorkshire village listed 3 children with the same surname enrolled briefly in 1824, then struck through with thick ink as though they had never existed. A church registry contained a baptism record for an infant, the ink faded but legible enough to show the same name once whispered in the hollow. The page that should have followed had been torn out. Local newspapers carried small, unsettling notices of disappearances near the moors. During the same period, shepherd boys who never came home. Travelers found wandering, dazed, claiming they had seen faces in the fog that followed them through the night. Historians piecing together these fragments began to suspect that the fire at Hollow Grange had been no accident at all, but a smokescreen. Perhaps it was a ritual of departure, a way of erasing themselves from Dorset before planting roots elsewhere. The villagers believed the blaze had ended the story, but the letters suggest otherwise. The family, with their mirrored features and silence heavy as stone, had simply walked away from the ashes and begun again under the shadow of the Yorkshire moors. The name was still alive, carried north in ink, and whispered in the margins of forgotten records, leaving behind the unsettling truth that some bloodlines do not perish, they only move, waiting to be found again. London's orphanages in the 19th century were crowded, their halls echoing with the noise of children abandoned by poverty, disease, or misfortune. Registers were kept with grim efficiency, each name carefully entered, each detail about age, health, or family background noted in the margins. Yet among those neat columns, scattered like faint stains, appear names that do not belong to the city. They carried the same unusual surname that had once haunted Dorset and later surfaced in Yorkshire. At first, a single entry, a boy of 9, pale and undernourished, admitted to a Southwark orphanage in 1836. His record gave no parents, only the initials J.B. A month later, his name was scratched through, the word transferred scrawled in the margin, though no destination was listed. More names followed in the years ahead. A girl of 7 entered into the ledger of a Westminster institution, her surname spelled clumsily but still recognizable. A boy of 12 appeared in a record from Hackney, listed alongside the words speech impaired and unfit for service. Yet these entries shared a strange pattern. Each ended abruptly. Some were crossed out. Others were left unfinished, the ink trailing as though the clerk's pen had been stopped mid-word. In several cases, entire pages were missing, torn carefully from the bound ledgers as though someone wished to erase not just the child, but the memory of their presence. The surviving scraps are unsettling in their detail. One matron, in a rare personal note, described the children as unnervingly similar, as though they had been cut from the same cloth. She remarked on their silence, their watchful eyes, the way they never joined in games or laughter, but instead sat in corners, heads slightly tilted, staring at nothing. Another note, buried in a caseworker's folder, remarks that one child answered to 2 names, both beginning with the same initial, and did not seem to understand which belonged to him. These were not the ordinary hardships of orphans. These were echoes of something older, something carried from the hollow into the heart of the city. The official reports grew thinner as the century wore on. By the 1850s, the surname had vanished from orphanage ledgers entirely, as if someone had intervened to remove it. Yet whispers remained. Some believed the family had used the orphanages as cover, placing their own children under false pretenses to hide in plain sight, only to reclaim them once suspicions grew. Others feared something darker, that the children were not reclaimed, but absorbed, disappearing into a silence deeper than the streets of London could conceal. What is certain is that the ledgers tell a story of incompletion, of lives begun on paper only to vanish mid-line, erased deliberately as if history itself recoiled from writing their names. In a city that prided itself on record-keeping, these absences stand out like open wounds, reminders that the forgotten family of Dorset had not only survived but had found their way into the very heart of England, leaving behind orphans that were not truly orphans at all. By the middle of the 19th century, the trail of the family stretched north again, this time into the coal towns of Lancashire. These were places already steeped in hardship, where men worked long hours underground, lungs blackened with dust, and accidents were common enough to be accepted as part of life. Yet in the company lodges and taverns where miners gathered after a shift, another kind of story began to spread, accounts of pale figures seen slipping into shafts long abandoned, shafts no miner in his right mind would dare enter. Some said they looked like children at first, small frames hunched against the wind, but when lantern light struck their faces, they bore the same hollow resemblance that had been whispered about for generations. The miners told of hearing voices drifting up from the dark, low chanting that carried through the stone passages. It was not the rough hymns they sang themselves to keep time, nor the drunken songs of relief after a long day, but something slower, rhythmic, and without words they recognized. The sound unnerved even the most hardened men. One foreman confessed that on 3 separate nights he heard the voices echo from a shaft sealed years earlier, and each time his team refused to work until prayers had been said over the pit mouth. Then came the collapse. It was in 1862 when a section of old tunnel caved in after decades of neglect. Rescue crews digging through the rubble expected to find nothing more than rock and dust, but their picks struck something that was not stone. Bones scattered in the debris, not all belonging to animals. The men swore some of them were human, small skulls with malformed jaws, rib cages too narrow, spines twisted as though shaped by sickness or birth gone wrong. But no official record of those bones was ever kept. The report of the collapse lists no casualties, no remains, only damage to the tunnels. Those who had seen the bones said they were ordered to silence, threatened with dismissal if they spoke. The fragments were quickly removed, bundled into sacks, and taken away under the cover of night. Still, the miners remembered. They told their children of pale figures in the pits, of shadows that lingered too long, of bones buried and erased from ledgers. In villages across Lancashire, mothers began warning their sons not to wander near abandoned shafts, not because of danger from loose rock, but because something else had claimed them. Whispers grew that the family had made the tunnels their refuge, using the labyrinth of coal passages as their home, their chapel, their trap. And though the official records remain silent, the voices of those who labored in the dark keep the memory alive. They say that in certain pits, long sealed, if you press your ear to the earth, you can still hear the faint sound of chanting, rising from somewhere far below, as if the family never left but only sank deeper, folded into the shadows of the coal itself. In 1852, a young historian from Cambridge took a peculiar interest in the whispers surrounding England's forgotten valleys. He was not a man of superstition but of scholarship, the kind who believed that every fragment of folklore was rooted in some historical truth. His notes, preserved only in fragments, suggest he first heard of the family while collecting rural songs and customs in Dorset. The villagers were reluctant, some outright refusing to speak, but enough muttered references surfaced to lure him further. He traced the surname through parish ledgers, stumbled across the faint connections to Yorkshire, and followed the echoes into the coal towns of Lancashire. Wherever the name appeared, he found the same unease, the same stories of pale children, of silence too deep, of disappearances swallowed by the land. When he returned to Cambridge, he set out to prove that the family was not myth but memory deliberately erased. He compiled his findings into an essay titled The Persistence of Isolated Bloodlines in Rural England. It was published briefly in a small academic journal, a curious blend of folklore, parish record, and eyewitness account. The historian argued that one family had carried itself across counties and generations, folding inward through intermarriage, moving from hollow to moor to coal town, leaving behind a trail of vanishings and silence. He quoted the priest's scorched journal, the doctor's ledger from 1784, and even suggested that the fire at Hollow Grange had been no accident but a ritual departure. The essay was met not with intrigue but ridicule. His peers dismissed it as fanciful, accusing him of dressing ghost stories in the language of history. The journal withdrew the piece within weeks, and the young historian's reputation began to falter. Friends later recalled his growing paranoia. He spoke often of being watched, of seeing pale figures near the college gates at dusk, of hearing footsteps in the cloisters when he was alone. In his private notebook, one line recurs again and again: "They are not gone. They are only moving." A few weeks after the essay was withdrawn, his body was found in the River Cam. At first it was called a suicide, but the details disturbed even those eager to dismiss him. His coat pockets had been filled with stones, forcing him beneath the water. Some claimed he had done this himself, a deliberate act of despair. Others whispered that the stones had been placed there, heavy hands ensuring he would never resurface. No inquest ever resolved the matter. His notebooks were sealed away, most of them missing by the time the university catalogued his papers. What remains of his work is little more than fragments, half-finished notes, torn letters, and the memory of an essay too quickly buried. Yet his warning lingers, faint but insistent, in the margins of those surviving pages. History has not forgotten them. It has been made to forget. By the late 19th century, the traces of the family seemed to drift away from the hollows and coalfields and toward the edges of the sea. Port towns along England's southern and eastern coasts began to collect stories that echoed the same unease once confined to inland parishes. Dockworkers, men hardened by labor and long nights on the quays, swore they saw entire families moving silently across the wharves after midnight. They never came by ship, nor left by it. They appeared as if conjured from the fog itself, barefoot, carrying nothing but small bundles wrapped in cloth. Their faces, illuminated briefly by the swing of lanterns, were described as identical cheeks, hollow, eyes wide and unblinking, mouths pressed thin in expressions too still for the living. No one ever spoke to them. Those who tried claimed the figures melted into the shadows before words could be exchanged, yet their presence left marks that could not be ignored. In Portsmouth, a watchman reported footprints across the damp planks of a dock, dozens of them, all bare, all small, none leading back toward town. In Hull, a harbor clerk swore he counted at least 7 children moving in a line behind an older woman, each one stepping precisely into the print of the one before, as though they had rehearsed the act until it became a ritual. The image haunted him so thoroughly that he wrote it into his logbook, only for the page to be torn out days later. Merchants who traveled the coasts repeated the same accounts. Families seen at a distance, always silent, always moving at night, their belongings few enough to vanish in the fog. Fishermen claimed to glimpse them along the shorelines at dawn, standing together on the sand with their backs to the sea, unmoving, as if waiting for something to rise from the water. One sailor confessed he heard chanting from the marshes near Dover, low voices carried on the wind. When he followed, he saw shapes moving among the reeds, pale faces turning in unison to meet his gaze. He fled and never returned to that shore. Official records did not capture these wanderings. The census remained stubbornly blank, church registers grew thin, and those who attempted to write down sightings often found their words dismissed as drink or delusion. But the rumors of silent migrations persisted. They suggested a family that no longer hid in single estates or valleys, but traveled as a living echo, slipping along the coastline, never rooted, never gone. For the dockworkers and sailors who witnessed them, the terror was not only in what they saw, but in what it meant. The family was moving, carrying its bloodline like a burden, and the sea itself seemed powerless to wash their presence away. When war came in 1914, the great machine of England's armies turned Salisbury Plain into a landscape of tents, trenches, and endless drills. Thousands of young men gathered there to prepare for the battlefields of France, their days filled with marching, shooting, and shouting officers. But when the sun fell and the camps quieted, other stories began to circulate rumors the army never wrote down but that soldiers whispered in mess lines and dugouts. They spoke of strange children who appeared at night, figures too pale for farm lads, lingering at the edges of the training fields where the lanterns cast their weakest glow. The sightings were always the same. A soldier on sentry duty would notice movement beyond the wire, shapes crouched in the tall grass or standing near the hedgerows. When he called out, no answer came. Instead, the figures stood in silence, their heads tilted in that same unsettling way described in Dorset and Yorkshire decades before. Some swore the children came closer if no one moved, drifting across the open ground barefoot, their eyes reflecting the lantern light like glass. But before dawn they always vanished, leaving no prints in the mud, no trace in the dew-soaked fields. A few men wrote home about the encounters. Letters recovered in family trunks decades later tell of sleepless nights, of the unease of being watched by children who never spoke. One corporal described it in detail. They stand in a line, 4 or 5 of them, always the same faces, though no one can see them clear. We thought them refugees at first, but their clothes are wrong, ragged, too old, and when we move toward them they scatter like smoke. Yet I know they are there, every night. The army dismissed the rumors as nerves, the product of exhaustion and fear before deployment. Officers threatened punishment for men who spread the stories, claiming it was bad for morale. Yet, the tales persisted, whispered across the camps as soldiers compared what they had seen. The most unnerving accounts came from those who swore the children followed them even during maneuvers, glimpsed just at the edge of vision, standing still in the mist when the columns marched past. When battalions shipped out for France, the sightings stopped, as if the children belonged only to the plane, but the memory clung to those who survived. Veterans spoke of it years later, their voices dropping when they recalled the nights of training before the slaughter began. For many, it was a darker omen than they dared admit, the sense that even before the trenches, they had already glimpsed death watching them quietly from the fields of home. As the Great War dragged on and England bled men into the mud of France, strange irregularities began to surface in the records kept back home. Training camps that had once bustled with recruits suddenly reported gaps in their numbers. Whole platoons that dwindled without explanation. The official reports labeled them deserters, runaways who had slipped away in the night rather than face the slaughter overseas. Yet the details never fit. No tracks were left behind, no belongings were taken, and not a single soldier was ever caught afterward in the towns or roads nearby. It was as though they had been erased, swallowed by the very soil of the plain. Archivists who examined the surviving ledgers decades later noticed the oddities. Pages where names were listed in neat order, suddenly broken by entire rows of blank lines. Notes scrawled hastily in margins. Unaccounted for, presumed deserted. No evidence of departure. The army moved quickly to cover such discrepancies. Newspapers never reported on the vanishings, and families were told their sons had deserted, a shameful fate that silenced most questions. But among the locals who lived near Salisbury Plain, another explanation took root, one passed in whispers over pub counters and along hedgerows. They said the forgotten family had returned. The stories grew darker in detail. Farmers claimed to see lines of pale figures moving across the ridges at night. Not children this time, but men. Their faces blank, their boots silent, their heads all turning in the same slow motion toward the campfires. A shepherd told of hearing singing in the fields near dawn, low voices, in unison, repeating words he could not understand. When he tried to follow the sound, he found nothing but rows of footprints leading to the training ground, and then stopping as if the earth had consumed the men whole. The phrase spread quickly. They don't take men, they take names. It was said with a shudder, as though the family did not need bodies to swell their ranks, only the identity of those erased. Some claimed to see familiar faces in the mist days after a regiment disappeared. Soldiers they knew by sight, now pale, silent, and watching from the edge of the woods, as though copied and returned. For the men in camp, the fear was not only of death abroad, but of vanishing before they ever left England, of being taken not by enemy fire but by something older and closer. The official story remained desertion, always desertion, stamped in the records with cold finality. But in the folklore of Wiltshire and Dorset, the truth lingered differently. The forgotten family was not gone, they had merely changed their appetite. In times of war, when names were written by the thousands, they reached out from the shadows to claim what the ledgers would not keep. In the heart of London, tucked between soot-darkened terraces and forgotten alleyways, there once stood a Victorian orphanage that carried little distinction among the dozens scattered across the city. Its name barely survived on scraps of stationery and the fading memories of council files. But what was uncovered in its sealed records decades later shocked even hardened archivists. When the building was condemned after the Second World War, crates of ledgers were moved into storage. Most of them recorded the mundane rhythm of 19th century institutional life: lists of admissions, accounts for coal and bread, reports of illness and death. But within one box, bound in cracked leather and dust, investigators found pages that chilled more than they illuminated. Across nearly 20 years of records, a pattern emerged. Dozens of children entered the orphanage under different dates, yet nearly all bore variations of the same surname, the same one that had once been whispered in Dorset and Yorkshire, the same one attached to disappearances in coal towns and fields. At first, the repetition could be explained as coincidence, the product of large families or distant relatives. But as the pages turned, the uniformity grew impossible to ignore. The initials matched again and again. The children's ages clustered strangely close, their features described in nearly identical terms: pale, withdrawn, unresponsive. What unsettled the archivists most was how abruptly the records ended. Entire names were scratched out with thick strokes of ink, so heavy that they tore through the paper. Some pages bore only partial entries, a child's name and age written clearly, then obliterated before the notes of health or placement could be filled. In other places, margins were marked with single, unsettling words: removed, unfit, returned. No destinations were given. The final ledger from the orphanage contained only a handful of entries, all incomplete, before breaking off entirely. Soon after these strange admissions, the institution closed its doors without explanation. Official reports cited financial strain, yet other orphanages of the time endured far harsher conditions. Locals whispered that the closure was not due to poverty, but to something discovered within the walls. A caretaker, interviewed years later, recalled that the children with the repeated surname never behaved like the others. They kept to themselves, speaking in murmurs only when forced, and often staring together at corners of the room as if waiting for something unseen. He said once, late at night, he heard them chanting softly in unison, their voices weaving in a rhythm that made his skin crawl. After the closure, the building was sold, its windows boarded, and eventually it was razed to rubble. But the records, sealed and hidden, carried the weight of what had been erased. To find dozens of children, all sharing the same strange name, only to have those names obliterated mid-entry, suggested a truth darker than any ordinary misfortune. The family had not just wandered into London's orphanages, they had multiplied within them, hidden in plain sight, until someone finally tried to blot them from history. When the estate in Kent was finally surveyed, it was little more than a ruin. Roof beams had long since caved in, ivy and nettles choking what once might have been gardens, and the stone walls sagged as though the land itself wanted to bury them. For decades, locals had avoided the property, calling it cursed ground, the sort of place where livestock wandered off and never returned, where fires would not burn evenly, and where no birds were heard in the trees. It was only when a team of archaeologists arrived to conduct a routine assessment before development that the ground began to give up its secrets. What they uncovered was not ordinary history, but something deliberately hidden. Scattered across the property, shallow depressions in the soil revealed themselves as graves, though no markers had survived above ground. The bodies lay only a few feet beneath the earth, as if someone had been in a hurry to cover them. The archaeologists expected pauper burials, common in the countryside. What they found instead unsettled them profoundly. The skeletons bore signs of deformities far beyond what malnutrition or labor could cause. Skulls were elongated, jaws uneven, teeth crowded unnaturally close together. Some of the bones displayed congenital twisting of the spine and ribs that seemed to curve inward, shrinking the chest. The pattern was too consistent to be random. It spoke of generations folding inward upon themselves, the biological scars of a bloodline that refused to open to the outside world. The team catalogued more than 20 burials before halting work, disturbed not only by the deformities, but by the way the graves had been arranged. They were haphazard, sometimes overlapping, sometimes aligned in crude spirals, as if following a pattern no outsider could decipher. At the edge of the largest grouping of graves, half buried in moss and soil, one stone slab stood upright. Its surface had been chipped by weather, but beneath the lichen, the archaeologist traced deliberate carving. 3 words, deep and unmistakable. The blood must fold. The phrase sent a chill through those who saw it. Fold into what? Fold how? It was less a memorial than a doctrine, as though the stone itself carried the rules of the family. To fold was not an accident of circumstance, but a command, a deliberate narrowing of the line until it bent back upon itself. The official report on the excavation was sparse. A few notes on the bones, a mention of anomalies, but nothing that captured the truth of what the diggers whispered among themselves. Some claimed they felt watched as they worked, that shadows moved at the edge of the trees even when no one was near. Others said the soil was wrong, too damp, too heavy, as if reluctant to let go of what it held. When development plans stalled and the site was abandoned once again, the graves sank back into obscurity. Yet the phrase carved into the stone remains the clearest message left behind, a warning etched in rock. The family's legacy was not accident, but intention. In the spring of 1923, travelers passing through the fringes of the Peak District reported something that would linger in memory far longer than the headlines of the day. A small hamlet, scarcely more than a cluster of cottages, a chapel and a single narrow lane, appeared abandoned overnight. Horses still stood in their stables, restless and unfed. Meals sat cooling on tables, bread sliced but untouched, porridge hardened in bowls. In one yard, laundry hung half-pinned to a line, shirts and stockings stirring in the breeze as though the hands that placed them there had vanished mid-motion. Chickens scratched unattended in the dirt, and in the chapel, candles had burned themselves to stubs. Wax dripped across hymnals left open to psalms of protection. When local officials arrived, they searched for signs of flight. There were no trunks packed, no wagons gone missing, no valuables obviously removed. Doors stood ajar, windows left unlatched, but there was no trace of where the people had gone. By count, nearly 40 souls had lived there, families of miners, shepherds, and widows scraping their existence from the moorland. None were ever seen again. The newspapers offered an easy explanation. They printed words like economic hardship and migration, claiming that the villagers had slipped away quietly in search of better work. Yet those who lived in the nearby valleys refused to accept it. They remembered too many details, too much strangeness in the days before the vanishing. A farmer from a neighboring village said he had heard chanting drifting across the moors at night, faint but rhythmic, carried on the wind like the sound of many voices speaking as one. A shepherd swore he glimpsed pale figures near the hamlet's edge, standing just beyond his lantern's glow, their faces indistinct yet disturbingly similar, watching as he hurried his flock downhill. Even the postman, interviewed years later, admitted he had grown uneasy delivering letters there, recalling the way children sometimes appeared in doorways without speaking, their heads tilted, their eyes lingering too long on his retreat. Among the locals, a single word passed from mouth to mouth in hushed tones: the family. They said the forgotten bloodline had moved again, sweeping through the hamlet like a shadow that erased names as easily as chalk from slate. The absence of struggle, the eerie stillness, the way life itself seemed paused rather than abandoned, all suggested something more deliberate than migration. It was not that the villagers had chosen to leave. It was that they had been taken or perhaps folded into something larger, their identities consumed by a lineage that thrived on repetition and silence. The hamlet today is little more than ruins. Stone walls collapse beneath ivy, hearths are filled with moss, and the lane has become a track no cart could pass. Walkers who stumble upon the place sometimes remark on the odd, quiet, how birds do not sing until they leave its boundaries. No official record remembers the vanishing of 1,923 as anything more than economic decline. But for those who grew up in its shadow, the story remains clear. A community did not die, nor did it flee. It was absorbed by a name too dangerous to speak above a whisper. In the official ledgers of England, the story of the family ends in silence. Their name, once scribbled in parish margins and orphan registers, has been scrubbed from nearly every surviving record. Pages where they appeared have been torn away, ink blotted until words are illegible, entire archives sealed under orders that were never explained. To the historians searching for answers, they seem to have vanished as thoroughly as the hamlet in the Peak District, leaving nothing but broken references and the faintest stains of memory. Yet history does not erase so easily. What is removed from paper lingers in whispers, in places where silence has weight, and in the uneasy recollections of those who dare to remember. Graves remain, scattered in forgotten fields and choked by nettles, where bones bear the scars of bloodlines folded inward too long. Journal fragments surface, scorched or half-crossed out, their warnings sharp in what little survives. Not Christian remains. The blood must fold. They are only moving. Each phrase stands as evidence, words that resisted erasure, even when their authors were lost to rivers, collapsed shafts, or the quiet turning of parish hands. They speak of a family that thrived not by visibility but by concealment, living between the lines of history rather than inside them. Even in the modern day, the trail has not disappeared completely. A letter tucked in an archive here, a census anomaly there, a child admitted to an orphanage with a surname that should no longer exist. They surface like ripples from something submerged, vanishing as quickly as they are noticed. For every page missing, another rumor persists. For every burned house or collapsed tunnel, another villager swears they saw pale faces at the hedgerow, watching in silence. The absence becomes its own proof, a pattern of concealment so deliberate that it betrays the presence it tries to hide. To speak of them now is to confront a truth darker than any superstition. This was not simply a family that withdrew from the world. It was a lineage that turned itself into shadow, feeding on secrecy, leaving behind disappearances and graves as markers of its passage. And while their name has been scratched out, their story resists burial. It lingers in the minds of those who stumble on their traces, unsettling and unfinished, reminding us that forgetting is not the same as absence. The closing truth is simple, and it is chilling. History does not forget. It hides. And in the hidden places, in locked archives, in shallow graves, in villages left empty without cause the family waits, their silence woven into the soil of England itself. To believe they are gone is a comfort. To know they are only hidden is to understand the warning carried across centuries. Some names do not die. They are only erased, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to write them again.